Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the late medieval period in our continuing study of the history of civilization. We have divided the Middle Ages into the early Middle Ages, that's from 500 to 1000, the High Middle Ages from 1000 to 1300, and today's study, the late Middle Ages from 1300 to 1500, all, of course, after Christ. In the early Middle Ages, we mentioned before, we had a very gradual population growth. That kicks into high gear with the High Middle Ages, where the population just takes off. But then as we come to the late Middle Ages, we're actually going to have a decline in population, and part of that will be the result of the plague that's going to come in the mid-1300s. But then there's going to be some other reasons as well. One of the things that we notice during this period is climate change. I'm not talking about worldwide climate change, so I don't have any political agenda here. I'm just expressing what was taking place in Europe during this time. In the High Middle Ages, there had been a warm period, followed by what we sometimes refer to as the Little Ice Age during the late Middle Ages. And that leads, it coincides with the population decline. Global warming might be a hot button issue today, and you talk about the bad things that can happen. But for Europe, in that period, global warming was actually good for people. Now we continue. The early Middle Ages, we have the barbarian invasions. The High Middle Ages, it's the Crusades, where now people in Europe are going to a different place. They're invading other places. In the late Middle Ages, it's going to be the formation of nation-states. In the early Middle Ages, we have a Romanesque architecture. We're going to look at that in just a moment, examples of that architecture. In the High Middle Ages, it's Gothic architecture. And then in the late Middle Ages, it's still like Gothic, but also influenced by the Renaissance. And so architecture is sort of a combination of those. So here's an example of that Romanesque architecture. Notice everything's very straight. The door is straight. It's got an arch in it. The windows likewise have the examples of the Roman arches. But everything's very solid. And solid is a good way to describe this Romanesque coming from the old Roman Empire. Next we have the Gothic architecture. Notice the very elaborate details along the top of the roof and upon the spires. Everything's high, everything's sort of exalted. And now we look at the Renaissance, which still has a portion of that, and yet there's an airiness, sort of an architecture of light that comes in the Renaissance, and still has some of those Gothic features. Next, I want to look at the Inquisition. The Inquisition, first of all, you start off with the Episcopal Inquisition beginning in 1184. That is, this was an Inquisition that was just within the church. The bishops were required to investigate their churches, and it really didn't work all that well. Largely ineffective. But then we have a Papal Inquisition now, beginning in the 1230s. Much more effective. The Dominicans are used for this, that order of the Dominican monks, and written records are kept and going to be turned into the papacy. Heretics are given a lenient penance if they denounce others, which encourages them to denounce others, and maybe if they don't have anyone to denounce, maybe they'll even make it up, because you can get off time if you get somebody else, if you blame somebody else. There's secret trials during this period, nothing public, and it's behind closed doors. Suspects aren't told of the charges against them, so that you can be arrested and questioned, and you don't know what you're being arrested or questioned about. They're looking for something of which you might be guilty, and they don't have to tell you what that is. Torture is allowed as of 1252, although and this is part of the normal judicial procedure. You'd take somebody, you'd examine them, you'd torture them, but confession under torture isn't legally admissible, which means that you have to confess without the torture. But if you don't confess, you're going to go back and be tortured again, and so it's sort of a never-ending cycle. Now, higher education during this period, we have the advent of the monastic schools, and we talked about the role that the Irish had in that aspect, and that's going to lead next to education within the cathedrals. Of course, the monasteries, very oftentimes they can be out in the middle of nowhere, The cathedrals are in the big cities, and so this is bringing education into the bigger cities as men are preparing for ministry in the context of ministry, in the context of the cathedrals. Not just ministry, they're going to be taught in other areas as well. And from the cathedrals, we're going to see education brought about by the formation of a new idea, the university. Now, the idea of the university is that you're going to study, well, think about the name, you're going to study the universe, such as it was known back then. First universities are at Paris and Bologna around 1200. There's no physical campus involved. In other words, you don't go somewhere and say, okay, this is the school. Rather, it's just a collection of students and teachers, and they might meet anywhere. They might meet outside, they might meet indoors, they might meet in a home. They would negotiate with the local towns who would actually pay a fee or give some other invitation to host the university. You see, it was very prestigious for a town or a city to have a university. It's going to be, at least, by the time we're done. The university, if the conditions weren't met, if certain concessions weren't granted, they could up and leave. And they say, we don't like the place where we're at now. They're offering us a better deal at another town. And because there's no building involved, they don't have to sell a building, so they can just up and go somewhere else. The University of Paris is going to be run by the teachers. Now, that's not going to be the same everywhere. But the teachers are running things, and the students, they can come and apply and study there. The specialty in Paris is going to be theology, and that's going to be a common theme. Not that the specialty will always be that, but that theology will always be taught in the university. The University of Bologna, instead, is run by the students, and that brings about a very different dynamic. Their specialty is in law. The teachers are paid directly by the students, so the way a teacher gets fired is that no students show up to his class. He's not getting paid. He can continue teaching, but there's nobody there to teach. And so it's the students run. Now, the student in the university would study he'd study in the Faculty of Arts, and there'd be things like mathematics and astronomy and music theory and grammar and logic and rhetoric. And he studied all of these areas, but then he would specialize in either law or perhaps theology or perhaps medicine. Eventually, there's going to be other specialties as well. All university students are given clerical status. And by clerical status, that means they're going to be treated as if though they were clerics. That is, as if they were a priest or a monk. Now, they're not. Sometimes they're studying for something that's way outside theology. They might be studying law. They might be studying medicine. But they're still going to be treated as if they were monks or priests or some sort of cleric within the church. And that means that if they break the law, they're tried not by the local magistrate, not by the local judge, but by the church. And so they could only be tried by clerical courts. And the penalty for striking a student, if you got into some sort of altercation, was excommunication. You were tossed out of the church because you just hit somebody. It was like hitting a priest. You weren't allowed to do that. Now, these students, both the university and the students, could be a disruptive influence in towns. And so as time went on, not only were the universities negotiating with the towns, but sometimes the town would say, we're tired of having university. This is getting a little too rowdy for our blood, especially when we cannot hold the students accountable. And so, university, we don't want you anymore. And that could happen as well. Now, women are not permitted at this time to attend universities. And next we want to talk about the 100 Years' War. And that's going to be a series of conflicts, actually one giant continuing conflict from 1337 to 1453. And it's England versus France. And the boundary lines, you would think, well, France is the mainland Europe and England is it's an island. Well, not always. And it's sort of going to go back and forth. Now, this is also a war in the use of the the English longbow versus the French knight. And the English longbow, that's a new weapon, and it's a weapon that's very cheaply made, and one can learn to use it relatively easy. I mean, he's got to work at it, but it doesn't take a lot of money to equip a simple person, and maybe even a peasant, with a longbow versus the kind of money that's used to equip a knight with his horse and his armor and his weapons and so on. And so the English find that they've discovered a way not only to get a lot more soldiers, but to destroy the class distinctions on the battlefield. Because one peasant with a bow and arrow can take down a knight who's might even be nobility, and yet that noble knight doesn't matter at all because a peasant can bring him down. Now, this is going to lead to eventually to taxes and nation states, because you need to have an army, not just a volunteer army that sort of crops up when you have a battle to fight, but a standing army, and somebody's got to pay for that, so taxes have to be raised. And this is going to lead to the formation of nation/state. Now, it's during this 100 Years' War that we have an interesting character rising from France, and that's Joan of Arc. She is a teenager, and she claims to have a vision. Wasn't there, so I can't really speak, but I think she believed that she had a vision from somebody or something. I think she saw something, and the French people believed her, and they were motivated by her and under her influence. Remember, she's not leading the army, but she's there, and she's certainly a positive influence, sort of a rallying cry behind the army. And the English are driven now from France, and so we will have the English in England, and we'll have the French in France. Now, another thing we want to talk about in 1453, same year that the 100 Years' War ends, and maybe the reason it ends is because there's bigger issues on the horizon, and that's going to be the Muslims. And Constantinople, which had stood now for 1,000+ years, now falls to the Muslims with the invention of gunpowder, where they're able to use these mighty cannons and knock down the walls and break through and capture Constantinople in the year 1453. And that will lead to that entire Byzantine Empire, which, I mean, honestly, had shrunk by this time, but it's going to open up the Balkans, what we call Greece today, and the places like Croatia and Bosnia and even Austria, to the Muslims, so that before we're done, we're going to have the Muslims marching all the way to the borders of Vienna in Austria. One last thing we want to talk about, and we'll cut it short today, and that's Gutenberg's printing press. Again, in the mid to late 1400s, we have the invention of the printing press, which is going to allow books to be mass-produced instead of all books being hand-copied. You copy each page by hand. That takes an enormous amount of time and an enormous amount of money, because you have to pay a scribe to do that. And suddenly now we have movable type, and we can print up something, and it can be ready for mass publication. Books are still going to be relatively expensive, but nowhere near what they are, and now they can be mass-produced. And that's going to change the world.